There we go. So, what's your full name?
Mary Ted Allen.
Great. How's your last name spelled?
Allen.
Thank you. Where were you born?
I was born near Clinton, New York. I was actually born in a hospital in New Hartford, New York, near Utica.
When was this?
October 7th, 1962.
Great. So you lived in Clinton then?
I did, all the way up until when I left for college.
Wow. So who was living with you?
My parents and my 3 sisters. I'm one of 4 girls.
What order were you in? Were you oldest, youngest, middle?
I'm number 3 out of 4. Miriam is the oldest. Then there's Sarah Jane and myself and Libby.
Did you have any extended family in the area nearby?
Absolutely. My grandparents lived in the town as well, because my dad's family had actually been in the town for 5 or 6 generations.
Wow. About what year did that go back to?
It went back to at least the mid 19th century, the mid 1800s,
Wow.
if not even a little earlier.
All in the same house?
No, not all in the same house. Although I think that my grandfather grew up in the house that he lived in, but I don't know when they acquired that house. So my dad grew up in that house, but I did not grow up in that same house.
What did your parents do for a living?
My dad's family owned a True Value hardware store. It was called, originally it was called H.J. Allen and Sons, and then when my dad only had daughters, they changed to H.J. Allen Estate. So H.J. stood for Hiram, and I don't remember his middle name, but that was my grandfather's grandfather or great-grandfather, I'm not even sure. But it was the family hardware store that was passed down generation to generation. It was the oldest family-run True Value hardware store in the country at one point.
Wow. So Clinton, New York, how big was it?
You know, it's a pretty small town. It's a little college town in upstate New York, and I recall that the town had about 10,000 people when I was growing up, but I think that it's grown since then, so it may be more like 20,000 now, but it's still pretty small.
So would you describe it as more diverse or more homogenous?
You know, that's an interesting question, because you would think it would be really homogenous, and yet there were so many immigrants to the area. When I was growing up, there were Lebanese families and at the time we considered this diversity, but, you know, there were Polish families and Greek families, and, you know, there were different communities with all of their different cultures and flavors of religion and cuisine and whatever. So it felt diverse, although it wasn't, you know, ethnically diverse the way, say, Seattle is, or we think of diversity today.
So do you feel like those groups mix a lot, or did they stay separate mostly? Both. There was, you know, family was important, and culture is always important, and so, you know, I think those families did a lot together and celebrated their holidays together, and yet we all went to school together, and everybody interacted with everybody else, so it wasn't segregated in any way. So do you feel like you knew a good portion of the people that lived there? Or?
Oh, I felt like I knew everyone. When I was growing up, we could drive up and down the streets of our town, and I could tell you literally who lived in almost every single house.
Wow. So how did that feel, community-wise?
Well, on some levels it felt great. It was very comforting. It gave you a really solid foundation, but at the same time, it made it feel really small. And when you're starting to grow up and you're getting into high school, it starts to feel really small and confining, too small.
So you had a slightly larger than average household with 3 siblings. Was that average-ish for Clinton, or?
It was pretty typical for the time period, but also our town was very heavily Catholic, and so a lot of families had at least 4 children. I had lots of friends whose families had 5 or 6 kids, but 4 was pretty typical.
Was your family Catholic?
No, we were not Catholic. In fact, I went all the way through high school until I was a junior in high school. I thought that the majority of the people in the United States were Catholic just because my town was. And I, of course, assumed my town reflected the rest of the country, only to find out later that that really wasn't the case. But we were not Catholic. We were Episcopal. But it was heavily Catholic.
So you and your sisters, do you feel like you guys were a lot alike? Did you do a lot of stuff together, or were you pretty much doing your own thing?
It was interesting. Sarah and Libby and I all did a lot of the same things. So we figure skated and we were cheerleaders and those kinds of things. And Miriam was always sort of a little bit different. She was more artsy, and she did lots of drawings and watercolors, and she was interested in gardening and things like that, and that's always been the case with her. She's an interior designer now, and she loves to cook and garden, whereas Libby and Sarah and I have always been a little more active in sports and things like that. But we were a lot alike, although I was more tomboyish and Sarah was more sort of perfectly coiffed at all times and very well put together all the time, and Libby was sort of a little bit of a whiny younger sister to me. She's a wonderful friend now, and she's an amazing woman today, but then I used to think of her as sort of my whiny baby younger sister. She had a sensitive stomach, and she just cried a lot. That's what I remember. But she's amazing today. She has an MBA, and she's the controller for a big nonprofit organization.
So do you feel like the family unit as a whole was really strong in Clinton, or stronger than it is in larger cities?
It was very strong. I can't say that it's stronger than in larger cities, but I guess in a way it is. I think that's why in a city it's so important to have other forms of community. Whether it's through a sports team or through your school or through the Boy Scouts or through something. I think it's just really important to have some community.
So your family was in Clinton for a long, long time. So, 6 generations?
Yep.
And then your generation, they all just sort of dispersed.
Yeah, I know. Pretty strange. But I think part of it's because the hardware store was an anchor for my family, but in the late 70s, that's when the big box stores started coming out, and so all of the the Sears and the bigger stores were competing with the little mom and pop stores, and so my dad, and inflation was just killing my dad's business, and so he got out of it. He was smart. He sold it at the right time because it would have been very hard to make it profitable beyond that. And none of us, we could see how hard my dad worked and how stressful it was. And so none of us wanted to take over the business from him. And so he ended up selling it. And so once he sold the store, there was really nothing, and my sisters and I had all moved on and lived elsewhere. There was really nothing to keep my parents there. So they decided to retire to a location that was closest to one of my sisters, or closer to one of my sisters, which I think was a good move. But it's kind of sad that we're not there anymore.
Do you ever wish that you guys could all be living near each other, or?
Oh, absolutely. I fantasize about it. Libby and I talk about her husband. She and her husband are looking into buying a golf course right now. And I told her that if they buy the golf course, though, we're going to have to come live near them so that we can play golf and tennis together. So maybe once you guys are off to college, Daddy and I will retire back east again. Who knows?